see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Amazing. Okay, so good morning, everybody. My name is David Raphael Shatsky. I'm a personal pension and insurance agent. Thank you, Helena, for asking me to speak again. And I chose to speak about a subject that, one, I wish I knew what I know today 20, 30 years ago. Maybe not 30, but 20 years ago. Second, it's a subject that's relevant to everybody, whether you're employed, self-employed, own your own company, whatever it is, it's relevant to you. And third, it's something that's practical. You could actually make a change or take action if you choose to, if you see it's right for you. And that's why I chose to speak about this subject. So I just want to ask you guys a quick question to do a quick experiment. And I want to ask, who here invests in the stock market, any stock market? Please raise your hand so I can see. Okay. And who here does not invest in the stock market at all? Please raise your hand. Okay, very interesting. Thank you. Okay, so what I want to talk to you guys about today is pensions and the stock market. And I want to answer three main questions on this subject. First, what they have to do with each other. Second, what you can do about it. And third is how it will affect me. So the first, what they have to do with each other. And this is why I asked the question, because basically anybody that raised their hand on the second question, most likely they do invest in the stock market, just you're not aware of it, or you don't think about it in that way. And any pension product that you have, whether it's a pension fund, a keren hishtalmut, a kupat gemel of any kind, basically your funds there are invested in the stock market by default. And the reason that your funds are invested, so you gain interest and the funds grow, and they're not just sitting there collecting dust like in the bank these days. So it's a good thing that they're invested, obviously. So just in a very simple way, basically the stock market contains stocks and bonds. So your funds are invested in both of these assets. Stocks are basically ownership in a company. So if you buy, for example, Apple stock, you basically own a tiny percentage of the company. And bonds are the debt of that company or that government. Stocks in general are considered more high risk. Just in the beginning of the year, if anybody follows, the S&P 500, which is the main index in the US, dropped by 35%. So stocks are very volatile and they can move up and down in very aggressive ways, versus bonds that are much more steady. They do move, but not as crazy as stocks. Stocks in general will give you over time a higher return of average 7 to 8%, versus bonds where you could expect 3 to 5% return over time. And stocks are very, very volatile, which means going up and down like crazy, versus bonds. Einstein has a very famous quote on this subject that says that compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world, and he who understands it earns it, and he who doesn't pays it. And Moesis is very familiar with this because he deals with this subject just from the other side of the debt or loan. So just a quick example, if somebody would invest $100 from 1927 until 2016, if you would invest that $100 in bonds, he would have $7,000, versus if he invested it in stocks, he would have $320,000. So as you can see, it's a huge, huge difference. And this is what Einstein was basically referring to as the eighth wonder. A more practical example is if somebody were to invest $2,000 every month for 40 years. If he didn't invest, if these funds weren't invested, basically making 0% every year, he would end up with $80,000 versus if he would to make a 5% return, which is very realistic, he would have $253,000, which is a difference of $173,000. So this just shows the power of the compound interest over time and why it's very important to have our funds invested and not sitting and doing anything. Okay, so now that we know that our funds are invested and that we have exposure to stocks and exposure to bonds inside our pensions and long-term investments, basically what can you do about it? What do you control? What can you change? What can you decide? And it's actually very simple. You can choose actively what's called an investment track or investment plan, or in Hebrew, as they call it, a maslul hashka'a. And these different tracks basically have different amount of exposure to stocks versus bonds. So for example, there are tracks that are considered very low risk that have zero exposure to stocks. And then you're not going to be making a lot of interest on these, but this could be good for somebody that's very close to retirement, for example. In 2008, by the way, in Israel, people weren't aware of this. And when the market crashed, people that were right before retirement lost like 20, 30% of their pensions within a year. And that's it. They didn't have time to reinvest and get those gains back. So basically their pensions were hurt in a very, very bad way. Another example, there's a track that's considered low risk that has up to 15% stocks, up to 25% stocks, things like that. This can be good if you're 3, 4, or 5 years away from retirement, something like that, that you do want some exposure to stocks, but not too high of a risk. And then there's the medium risk. 9 out of 10 people here today statistically are in the 30 to 40% exposure to stocks. The reason being is that that's the default plan. If you haven't actively chose something else, that's where you are. So statistically, over 90% of people are here. You have 30 to 40 exposure to stocks, percent exposure to stocks. This is in your pension, in your keren ishtalmut, whatever it is. And the last example, there are investment tracks that are considered high risk that have at least 75% exposure to stocks. Okay, this can be a very, very volatile track. There are tracks that even go up to 100%. But they have to have, if you choose a track like this, you have usually at least 75% of your funds in stocks. So now that you know that there are different tracks and different things that you could, by the way, you can switch tracks whenever you want. It doesn't cost money. It doesn't have any tax effects or anything like that. It's very easy to do. And now that you know that you can do that, how do you know what to choose, what's right for you, what's best? So what should guide you in general is the younger you are or the longer term your investment is going to be, the higher exposure to stocks you should have. So if you're 35 and your pension investment is until you're 67, so that's 32 years, that's a very, very long period of time. And in general, you should have a higher exposure to stocks because you're going to get a higher return. If you're going to get a higher return, you're going to have more money in the future when you retire. On the other hand, if you're 65, retiring in 2 years, you want to have a lower exposure to stocks. So this should be the main thing that guides you when you choose the combination of stocks and bonds in your pensions, in your long-term investments, your portfolios, whatever it is. Of course, everybody has their own risk tolerance as well, which also comes into play when choosing. So how will it affect me? I want to give you a more very, very realistic, specific example. So one of my first clients was a good friend of mine. We'll call him Avi. And when I met him, he was 35. His salary, he was employed, his salary was 14,000 shekels. He had at the time 130,000 shekels saved up in his pension, and his monthly deposit from basically his payslip, if you're employed, the deposits come out of your payslip, was around 2,500 shekels. So I told him, listen, Avi, if you keep on working from now until you're 67 with the same exact salary, with the same exact deposit, you're expected, and you get a return of 4% average every year, you're expected to have 2.4 million shekels in your pension fund. Just to show you how important it is to invest, if you see the green lines on the right at the end, the green line is basically the interest that he gained over the years, and the blue is what he deposited. So the interest is even larger than the funds he put inside his pension. And he, of course, was at the time in the medium risk track, like almost everybody. And I told him, listen, if let's say you make 1% more each year, because you're in a higher risk track. So let's say you make 5%. And then I showed him 5%, his expected pension would be 3 million shekels. So that's a difference of 600,000 shekels that he will have in his pension fund when he retires. If he makes 1% more, the difference between 4% to 5%. So theoretically, you could have two identical people with the exact same statistics, same salary, same pension fund, same fees, same deposit. If one made 1% more versus the other, just because the investment track he chose, he would have 600,000 shekels more inside his pension fund. And there's not many small decisions that you could just sign a paper that could affect you in hundreds of thousands of shekels. So it's very important to be aware of this and how it works. And this just shows the power of and the importance of your annual return and the way you choose how to invest your funds. So the bottom line and my message here is, first of all, to make you aware of this subject so you know that you are invested in the stock market if you thought that you're not. To check what tracks you currently have today in all your different products, pensions, private savings, keren ishtalmut, and so on. And check if they're right for you. Check if it's good for maybe for you to make a change. Obviously, this is not a general recommendation for everybody to change to high risk. Everybody's a different age, different financial situation, different risk tolerance, and so on and so on. So you should get personal advice on this subject before making a change, but definitely do check and do learn about it and do ask about it and potentially do make a change if it is right for you. So thank you for listening. Happy investing, and I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Sure.
I want to stop sharing your screen, David.
1 second, okay.
Okay, first of all, always interesting topic. My question is, how often should you review your current pension to determine if it's still right for you?
So investment track wise, your pension, if you're investing it for the long term, and your pension you can't take until you're 60, okay? So the earliest you're gonna take those funds is 60. So in my opinion, you could be in the high investment track until you're at least 50 to 55, and then maybe start to consider to bring down the exposure to stocks.
You can't pull it, David. You can't pull it, but you can change. You're able to review it, like he's asking, like Gil's asking, and to possibly change it, even though you can't pull it.
Right. So I'm saying because you can't pull it, so you know the funds are going to be there until age 60, right? So if I'm 36 now, I'm not even considering bringing down my exposure to stocks in my pension fund until I'm at least 50 plus. Okay, so if I'm 55, for example, and I plan to retire when I'm 60, I might start bringing down my exposure to stocks just by changing my investment track inside my pension fund. Now, other investments that are more liquid, for example, your keren ishtalmut, This is more individual and depends what you plan to do with these funds. If you plan on using your Keren Ishtamut in a year from now for a bar mitzvah or whatever, I tell you bring down your exposure to as low as possible. Because if the market crashes, you take out that money, that's it. You're going to have those losses and you're going to lose money. But if the pension goes down in the next year, you don't care. You still have another 20 years for it to recover and to gain. So for your pension, until 50 plus, I wouldn't even look at the investment track wise. Other aspects, that's something else. Fees, what product you have, things like that, you should review more often. And more liquid investments, you should basically, based on your specific needs.
Don't you also
horizon.
Don't you also need to look at how each pension fund performs in terms of what they invest in? Because the numbers you gave must be like average statistics, rather. It's not something that applies to every single company, and some will probably invest better than others.
Right, correct. You can, and I do recommend to see different companies' performances. But at the end, I do think that what's more important is the track that you choose versus which company you choose. So if you're 35 and you want to have a high risk, having a high risk is more important, in my opinion, than in which company you have the high risk with. You know what I mean? But yes, you should check these things as well, for sure.
Just a suggestion, Helena, if I may. We're going to have David Nachum give us a talk about the tax implications next time.
Definitely.
David, I have
He's too quiet.
No
He's sitting too
problem.
quiet.
Just one more.
What?
You won a
You're
million
sitting too
shekels. He's
quiet.
done now.
Like-
He's finished.
There are huge tax implications. Vis-a-vis the pension and the Keren Ishtamut. You got to say something.
Yeah,
You're
well, the floor is David's now, so I don't want to interrupt. But yeah, I would be happy to talk about it. And if you want to consult privately, sure. I mean, a lot of things to say.
I think Benjamin had a question.
I actually have two questions for David. Number one is how can one better manage, for Atzmaim in particular, how could one better manage putting money into the pensions and the Keren Ishtamuts when you have, let's say, an unsure level of income? It's not a salary. It could come, it could go. You could have, you could not have. That's question number one. Number two is there any way to? Actually, I have a third question also. Is there any way to, if you have some sort of, what I understand is that you have to put in the money by December 31st in order for it to count for that calendar year. So, not all of us close our books necessarily on December 31st. And sometimes I find myself cash tied. And so even though I'd like to be able to put, let's say, 30% of my money away, I don't have the cash. So the question is there any way to leverage, like give a promissory note, like I want to put this in, I just can't put this in right now. I don't understand the mechanics with something like that. If you're totally closed out, if you miss writing your check by December 31st. And then just one other general question, which deals with what you spoke about. And I feel like the pension companies themselves, they're very, I feel like they're ultra conservative. I mean, I don't know if I'm right or wrong, or I don't know if it's very highly regulated or not. But basically, my pension hasn't moved in years. I just keep putting money in, it just kind of stays the same, and they take fees out. Why? Because every now and then when I actually open up and look at the papers, and they put me in like the 90-year-old route, not the 40-year-old route.
Okay, so yeah. So first question, basically if you're self-employed, if you're an Osek Moshe or Osek Patur, you could put in a certain amount every year and get tax benefits for. The amount that you could put in is based on that year's revenue. Not your revenue, it's more your revenue after you deduct your expenses. Mm-hmm. So what I recommend to people is on a monthly basis to do a little lower than what you estimate your income will be. And towards the end of the year, which is now, ask your accountant, where do I stand? And if you have extra amounts that you could deposit and get tax benefits for. So then you could just do that as a one lump sum payment. And that I, of course, recommend to do. So that's the first question. Second question, you have to make the deposit within the year. You can't make a deposit after January for 2020 and get tax benefits for it. So you have to just plan financially to have the cash to put in the same year if you want to get the tax benefits. You can't like say, I'm going to put it in and then do it after. It has to be within the same year. So just prepare in advance the best way you can to have the cash to put in.
Unfortunately, as an accountant, I'm like, the story of the Sandler. I'm good at doing everybody else's taxes, but my own, don't know what I'm doing.
Right. That's also why I tell people that are self-employed to set up a monthly payment, because at the end of the year, there's tons of expenses. And then on top of that, all of a sudden the pension, and then they have too many expenses and they can't maximize their pension deposits, their Keren Ishtalmut deposits. All of a sudden they have a debt to Mas Hachnasa, Bituach Leumi, and things like that. And the third question, as of being conservative, you can choose the track. That's basically what I'm saying here, is that you have the option to choose a track that is less conservative, that has higher exposure to stocks. They have even now, which is very common, and a lot of people are going towards these tracks in the Keren Ishtalmut and pensions that have track that actually make the S&P 500. So it's more of a passive approach of investing, and it's becoming more and more common today to take that route, opposed to having the companies actively manage and invest the funds. So you could just basically mimic the S&P 500, which is not considered conservative. It's 100% exposure to stocks.
Sorry, what's
so you
that
have
track?
control.
I didn't get the name.
It tracks the S&P 500 is basically the biggest 500 companies in the United States that are publicly traded. So basically tracking that basically means you're investing in those 500 companies.
Okay, like a mutual fund thing.
It's more like a mutual fund is more of an actively invested track. This is more of a passive, more similar to an ETF, if you will, or to Datsal, maybe what's called in Israel. Basically, it's 100% stocks.
Okay.
I have a question about the S&P 500, actually, since you mentioned it. My husband and I are thinking about possibly investing in that. Is it something that you would recommend? And also, how do you do that with an Israel? Because our money is in Israel, but like I understand there are like automated ways to do that with like Betterment or Vanguard, but this is in the US, right? So I'm just wondering how to go about this in Israel.
So if you're self-employed, so the first thing I would do is open a Keren Ishtalmut and invest in S&P through that, because the Keren Ishtalmut has tax advantages opposed to just investing directly in the stock market. So you could open a Keren Ishtalmut that tracks the S&P 500 and you'll have tax advantages. So that will be the first thing I would do. After that, there are also different options that you can invest in S&P. It could be, you could open a brokerage account, you could open a Kupat Gemel Hashka'a, you could do a lot of different things.
I want to say something. Well, thank you, first of all. So two things, actually. So one thing is that, David will always talk about how to make more money as for the risk, but as an accountant, maybe, it comes with the work. I would always talk about the risk, right? Because it always like the balance between how much money you're gonna think you earn and compared to the risk. So by the way, I agree about the age thing. I mean, if you're young, why not invest? Why not investing? Especially because we've seen that the stocks were doing very well in the last, I don't know, like 30 years or so, even more than the real estate market, by the way. But I don't know, psychologically, people like to invest in real estate. I don't know, maybe because they want to see the bricks in front of them, instead of money somewhere shows up as numbers on their screen. But anyway, the other thing I wanted to say David, and maybe you want to talk about it as well, is negotiate the fees, because that would save a lot of money as well in front of the insurance companies.
Yeah, that's a subject within itself. There are different products with different fees. Pension funds and Bituach Menalim have different fee structures. In general, pension funds are cheaper. The fees today are very, very cheap. They came down dramatically in the last 3, 4, 5 years. Whatever salary, income, deposit you have, you can get very low fees today. And the fees are, of course, very, very important, but usually the range that you can negotiate is like your fees can be 0.2, 0.15, 0.1, unless you're paying the maximum of 0.5. So even if somebody's paying 0.2, which today, like if you're paying over 0.2 in a pension fund is considered on the expensive side. So let's say you're paying 0.2 and you go down to 0.15 or 0.1, this will have probably a less of an impact than the investment track over a long term. Now, it doesn't have to be either or. Of course, you should try to get your fees as low as possible on all of your products. Keren Ishtamut, pension fund, Bituach Menalim, always true that you want the lowest fees possible.
Any more questions?
If you want me to say something about the tax, then I can do it in like 1 or 2 minutes.
Let's I'm going to do break homes and then we'll do it because it'll give me time also. So let's do that. Yes.
Well,
Helen, can I just make a quick comment, if I may?
Absolutely.
First, I'll actually send it to Benjamin Simon. Benjamin, when I was in Canada, I was a real estate broker, real estate developer. So I'm an independent contractor. So it's not that I got a stable paycheck every single month. And some months I would be remunerated or paid, other months I wouldn't be paid. But at the end of the year, nonetheless, I have a tax burden that I need to pay. And any investments or investment vehicles, they still need my money, right? So early, I started young, and I quickly realized that at the end of the year, kind of the longer story, sometimes there was a shortage of funds to pay these things. So basically what I did along the way was I figured out what is my approximate tax burden in terms of a percentage, right? So if I make X, approximately what percent are they going to take away from me? And B, I need to carry my other, coupot and whatnot, and my other investments. And I would come up with an aggregate figure or a total number of how much I needed to put aside per month. Then at the end of the year, there's no black clouds hanging because you've already taken the time and effort to actually just put those funds aside, if that makes sense. That's one thing I wanted to add. The other thing I wanted to add was this notion with the fees. So when I came from Toronto and I got started with my first coupot and Bituach Menalim, they really took advantage of me with the fees. I have a friend who's in this world. He took a look at my stuff and basically said, you're paying like almost 3 times what the rates are today. I went back to my broker. He pushed back. Some of my coupot are through a company called Phoenix. I called them directly. They pushed back. So I put everybody on notice that as of right now, I'm basically going to either transfer my fees or I'm going to make some new, my funds, or make some new arrangements for myself because I'm being taken advantage of. Suddenly these people who didn't want to help me are begging me to stay with them, and they're giving me all kinds of offers to lower the fees. So you've got more power than you think if you actually need to lower those fees. They will try to take advantage of.
Awesome. I have one very quick question for David. I very rarely ask, but this was really interesting and so relevant to what I'm definitely dealing with now. Say hypothetically one was late 20s, maybe say 28, for example. Is there kind of a reason to just invest, like obviously have a pension, but to invest more in Keren Ishtamut until you reach that maximum and then start with the pension because of age? Or is it still worth like continuously upping the pension at the same time as upping the Keren Ishtamut?
They're very different because the pension has coverages as well. They both have tax advantages. So it's hard to answer because it depends on your specific situation.
Yeah.
In theory, it's best to maximize out both. But if you're in a situation that you have to choose either or, so it's a little more complicated because if you're putting more in your Keren Ishtamut on expense of your pension, you might be hurting your coverages. And then God forbid if you're not able to work because of sickness or an accident. So you might be getting a very low payment from your pension fund because you did that, and that will be a bad thing. So,
got it. Okay.
You need to make a right balance between based on your specifics.
Such fun. Love being self-employed. Okay, thank you so much. That was amazing. A round of applause for David. That was really, really great. And obviously, if anyone has any further questions, I'm sure David is available. After this meeting, I'll be sending out everybody's email addresses. So you're welcome to, I'm sure, message David and arrange a consultation with him. I'm now going to do the second breakout rooms of today. There again will be a third. So if there's anybody that you want to speak to, please do message me. It really makes it better for you and better for me. So I'm going to put you into. Was David Nachum raising his hand, or was he just? Okay, you're good. Okay, cool. So I'm going to put you into breakout rooms now. And if anyone, I'm done. So it's now 10:15. So I'll bring you around about 10:25, 10:30. Yeah.